And in the course of all of that, I was introduced to Israel back when I was in Illinois.
Okay.
And from the very first time I set foot on the Holy Land, something in my heart was strangely touched.
You knew.
I knew. And I mentioned on the radio program earlier, before I went the first time, an old retired Methodist pastor came to my office, made an appointment, came to my office. He said, "Mark, I came just to tell you one thing. I'm very excited that you're going to Israel." And he said, "I believe that Israel will be the only place you'll never live that you'll always be homesick for."
That is awesome.
And it's true.
And that happened.
That's exactly what happened.
Oh my God.
I fell in love with the land, and I fell in love with the people. And so as I started the company Infinity Concepts in 2002, which is about 10 years later,
Okay.
We very quickly began to build relationships with people in the Jewish community and the Israeli community, and that was part of my heart. And so, of course, we've served the Israel Ministry of Tourism for a number of years, but beyond that, there's a number of Christian ministries that serve Israel. And there's a number of Israeli organizations that are building bridges to the Christian community, and we're working with those organizations and very excited about what God is allowing us to do.
Wow.
And one of those is the city of Akko. Now, it might sound a little strange that we're working with the city of Akko.
Yeah. How did you get first involved with that? Tell us.
I visited Akko on one of my first trips there.
Okay.
Maybe not the first, but one of my early trips to
Okay.
Israel. Visited Akko. I just put it on the itinerary as adding so I could see as many sites as possible.
And describe, because not everybody's familiar with Israel. Tell us a little bit about it.
So Israel is about the size of the state of New Jersey.
Right.
And on the west coast of Israel is the Mediterranean Sea.
Okay.
And the northern border of Israel is with Israel and Lebanon.
Okay.
About 40 miles south of that border is the city of Akko.
Okay.
Now, Akko is an ancient city. The biblical reference is Ptolemais, Ptolemais, I believe is how it's spelled, Ptolemais.
Okay.
And it says that Paul overnighted there on his way to Rome, because the ships would travel around the coastline of the Mediterranean. And so Ptolemais was the first stop if you were coming from Europe to Israel, or the last stop before you left.
All right.
And so the ship paused there, loaded up with its cargo, and it says that Paul spent a day there with his friends. And so there is record that Ptolemais was there, Akko was there in biblical times.
Okay.
We know it's part of the Promised Land, part of what was the inheritance of the sons of Israel. But the city of Akko came into real prominence later in history.
Okay.
And it became the entry point, the gateway to the Holy Land.
Wow.
Most of the travel to the Holy Land was by ship.
Right.
And that ship would come around the Mediterranean coastline from Italy to Greece to Macedonia, then down to Israel.
Okay.
And Akko became the gateway to the Holy Land. For centuries, that's how Akko was known.
Wow.
And everyone who would come on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land came through Akko. When the Crusaders came, they all arrived at Akko.
Okay.
And then from there they would travel inland to Jerusalem or Bethlehem or wherever they were going. But they would arrive at Akko. That was the port.
Starting point. Yeah.
And that would be a starting point.
Okay.
Later, when the Crusaders actually captured Jerusalem and then began to rule the Holy Land, there was a period of time when Akko actually became the Crusader capital. And so the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem had its capital in Akko.
Wow.
So it's a city that's rich with heritage, and although it's typically not on a Christian itinerary because it doesn't have a lot of strong biblical reference. I believe it needs to be on the Christian itinerary because it's a very strong, there's a very strong message we need to understand that we can I don't know any place where you can receive that message and understand it better than Akko.
And tell us why that is.
And tell you why that is.
Yeah.
All right. Well, you know, most of us in the West don't really understand the Crusades very well. I thought I did. I went to school. I did pretty well in school. We studied the Crusades. We studied there were a number of different Crusades, and Richard the Lionhearted, and all the things that were done. And those were always pictured to me in my school as noble events.
Right.
This was the church rising up and reclaiming the Holy Land from the infidels.
Yeah.
It was the church regaining what was rightfully belonging to the church, and so they went in there and tried to get rid of the infidels, get rid of those who would desecrate the Holy Land. But there's another side to that story. And in order to understand that story, one has to understand the relationship that evolved between the church and the Jewish people. And most of us don't know that story. I can guarantee you that the Jewish people in your community know that story all too well.
Because it wasn't a good story for them.
It's not a good story.
Yeah.
But Christians are oblivious. It's
Sure.
not that they're callous. They just don't know. When I first went to Akko with some pastors, I took a group of 10 pastors and their wives on a trip, and we visited Akko. And when I began to share some of what we're going to talk about today, none of these pastors had any idea.
Not one.
Not one. They were all pastors of large congregations. Most of them had doctorates in theology. They'd studied the Word. They'd studied church history. Not one of them understood the dynamic of the Crusades and the Jewish people, or the early church history and the Jewish people. And it's very important to understand that, because, you know, in the beginning, Jesus was a Jew.
Absolutely.
He celebrated all the feasts like Jews do. He prayed with the prayer shawl as Jews do. He observed all the customs. He was the epitome of a good Jew.
That's right.
And the early disciples were Jews as well, and were following his example. And so Christianity was birthed out of Judaism.
That's right.
In the early days, Christianity was viewed as a Jewish sect.
That's right.
A sect of Judaism. But as persecution began to come, Christians and Jews started separating, because there was different seasons of different kinds of persecution, but they began to separate and not identify with one another, identify differently.
Sure.
Ultimately, in about, I'm not going to get exact dates, but we'll just kind of talk in terms. A couple hundred years later, about 300 AD, there was an official edict that defined that Christians are not part of Jews, and Jews have nothing to do with Christians, that we are separate and apart.
So it was like bringing that dividing line to a real point.
Right. So what began to be just a distancing actually became a division. And that was the beginning of the problem. That wasn't the end. That wasn't where it stopped. That was where the real problems began. Because if they are not us, and it's a we and them, then we feel about them differently.
Sure.
And so when Constantine came into power and Christianity became the official religion of the state, now Christianity was in a position of authority.
Right.
And Judaism was not. In fact, there were edicts that no one was allowed to convert to Judaism. There were edicts that you know, Jews could not live in the same communities as Christians, and certainly Jews could not marry Christians, and Christians could not marry Jews. And then time goes by, and then Christians were not allowed to do business with Jews.
Yeah.
And then Jews were expelled from communities and countries because they didn't want any Jews living in their countries, all in the name of Christ.
Yeah.
Remember this.
Yes.
Then there was persecution, where they were forced to convert
Or die.
or die.
Yeah.
Sometimes they had a third choice of leave, but oftentimes it was convert or die. All in the name of the cross, in the name of Jesus. There were, as it moved on, it became very anti-Semitic in the 700s, 800s, 900s, leading up to the Crusades. Jews were looked on as less than real people. Yeah. During the holidays, they were not allowed to show their faces in the streets during the Easter holidays because they were viewed as Christ killers. Mm-hmm. There was a definitive, not just separation, but anger and distrust and persecution extended toward the Jewish people. And it's in that context that the Crusades emerge.
Right.
That now the church, in authority and having power and now having military might, is going to go and recapture the Holy Land because Christianity has not been alive in the Holy Land very well. So we're going to go take it back. Get rid of the Muslims that are ruling in the area, and let's take the land back. And so they begin to sweep across the land, and as they do, whenever they encounter a Jewish community, they wipe the community out. Men, women, children, thousands are killed. They come into the Holy Land, the Promised Land, the land that God gave to the Jewish children. And there, whenever they find a community of Jews, they kill them. There are stories of men, women, and children being herded into a synagogue, doors locked, and the synagogue burned to the ground while everyone burned alive. These are the Crusaders. Yeah. And this plan, this management of the Jews by the Crusaders was orchestrated from Akko.
From Akko.
The capital of the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem. So there's a lot of significance here.
Yeah.
And I want to, as we're talking later today, I want to tell you when you go to Akko today, how that all comes to life.
Well, Mark, we want to do that, and we're going to take a break, go to a song, and then when we come back, we'll find out why this is something that people should really put on a tour, and some of the significance of going there, and some of the healing that can take place, and why this would be a very important place to be able to pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for Israel, and a little bit more. We want to find out, too, when we come back, a little bit how things develop there in Akko, and then what it's like now.
Yes.